Hello. This week's topic is coverage of race. And before I get into that, I just want to remind you well, that's the wrong verb because of course, you already know, but point out that the articles about the president's tax returns after the New York Times obtained the tax material was probably the biggest story in the world and was on the front page of news media from all over the world for 24 hours. And I hope you took the trouble to read some of it and to compare coverage in different places. It's a very long and complicated story. And one element in the Times package, I will pull this out an email to you, was something like, 8 takeaways or 13 takeaways about the president's taxes. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is the first debate is tonight, and we'll see how that goes. I think nobody knows if it will be a good debate, an honest debate, or just turn into a circus. And we'll just have to see. I know the moderator tonight is Chris Wallace, and he has said that he thinks his job is to get out of the way and let the candidates talk. So that sounds like an invitation to chaos, but we will just see. When it comes to the topic of race, I think first of all, I want to acknowledge that I don't think I have a great deal to offer. I think this is an issue that's all around us every day and touches so many different aspects of society and so many different aspects of news culture. Race permeates discussions of politics, of education, of healthcare, of housing, of employment, of immigration. The list, is endless. And so I trust that not just in this course, but for years, as long as you've been literate and watching television or the internet, you've been hearing a lot of stories about race. I think there are several things I want you to keep in mind which are related. One way to look at coverage of race and to try to decide if it's fair is to ask yourself, how many different points of view do you see? Do you see spokespeople for the races that are being written about? Are they given an opportunity to speak and explain themselves and talk about their goals? Are there critics? There are insiders and outsiders. And I think one way that coverage of all race issues, and in fact of all issues, can be improved is by getting a broad range of sources and voices. I think that when it comes to race and journalism, one issue that's been increasingly raised is employment opportunities and advancement opportunities for people of color. This has been an area of concern literally for decades, and major news organizations and organizations of news organizations like the Associated Press managing editors have launched program after program and initiative after initiative trying to diversify their staff. Some have succeeded and some have not. I think some have made a vigorous effort and some have made no effort at all. One interesting aspect of the New York Times decision last year to start showing little photos of the reporters named in a byline on their website is if you could do a before and after, but you couldn't have done a before because this wasn't done 10 years ago, you would see that there is a greatly more diverse staff. And that, I think, speaks to a desire to uncover and unpack different types of stories. But, we do need to keep in mind that the Times is one of the wealthier papers in the country. And there are many smaller papers that lack the resources to diversify, lack the resources to compete for the journalists of color who are in high demand. So I think it's a complex problem. I think there are readings available about surveys and whether things are getting better. Aside from the internship programs and the hiring programs, I think there's some very real questions about how diverse management is, how diverse ownership is. The answer to the last one is hardly diverse at all. And how much difference that makes to what you cover. Excuse me a second. Of course, that question about opportunities for advancement, opportunities to become part of management, opportunities for ownership are asked not just about journalism, but about professional sports teams, the worlds of culture and the arts, and many different industries and companies within those industries. It's a very big issue in Silicon Valley, too, as you probably know. So there's been a lot of criticism of journalism and journalism organizations for this lack of diversity in their staff. And there's also been a lot of criticism of their choice of stories. And then there's criticism of the people they speak to and the organizations they seek out in doing those stories. In some way, we can assume they're all related, though hiring more people of color doesn't necessarily ensure that you'll get more diverse stories unless you make clear that you welcome them and that you will find space for them in your web pages or in your print edition or in your broadcast. So there's a whole chain within the administration and management of a news organization that needs to change to effect that. It wasn't so long ago, well, for me, let's say go back to the 30 years or 40 years to the 70s, where many news organizations were not only all white, but they only employed people who spoke only English. And this made it very difficult for them to do stories about immigrants, about all the issues that we've looked at that involve immigrants. If you're trying to report on immigrant communities and you don't have anyone who speaks that language, you are very limited in what you're going to be able to uncover. In the same way that if a foreign correspondent is sent to a country where she doesn't speak the language, you're going to be entirely dependent on people who can speak both languages or more than one language and translate for you. And back in the bad old days, I think there were a lot of American journalists who were dependent on hotel doormen and taxi drivers to get their information. My good friend and former student Ken Belson of the New York Times, whose current assignment is to cover the National Football League, lived in Japan for many years and is part of a Japanese family and is fully fluent in Japan. And he talks about how when he was based in Japan, the Japanese government has press briefings every day for journalists, different ministries of the government, different officials. And they would have one briefing in English, and then they would have another briefing in Japanese. And Ken said, when you went to the Japanese one, he said, first of all, if you were fluent, you would understand what the people in the audience were saying to each other and how the other journalists there were reacting to the presentation. But that also you would be able to pick up nuance and subtlety and context that sometimes wasn't available if you were only listening to a translation. And I think that that notion applies in the United States and many other countries to coverage of race. You need to not only speak the same language and understand the same language, with its slang and nuance and wondrously different vocabularies, but you also have to have an understanding of the culture and what people value and how they express those values, whether it's in their views of religion, of family life, of the working world, of authority, of food, of music. You can't really cover the rich diversity of American society and in its multiracial aspects unless you have some knowledge and a willingness to learn. And I think we do see more of that, but perhaps we need more still. I don't remember if I mentioned this on the first day of class, but I wanted to talk for a minute about the expression melting pot, which you've probably heard. And the notion of the melting pot was that as immigrants arrived in the U.S., whatever their race, wherever they came from, they would slowly sometimes, but gradually be assimilated into American culture. And they would learn American values, they would become fluent in English. And the idea was that there are all these rich ingredients that would be stirred into the pot of the American population and melt and assimilate, and the result would be a deliciously flavorful stew. And that expression was held up almost in an ideal of society in the melting pot. And starting in the 70s and then much more prominently in the 80s, a different set of images or imagery began to be used. And that was to think of society as a gorgeous mosaic where there were distinct, recognizable parts all fitting together to make a greater whole, but without losing their individual identities. And I think that image has become, for many people, a better dream of what a multiracial society should look like, and that people should be encouraged and recognized for preserving their own particular cultures. I think another important point to make when we're thinking about race is there's a tendency in some quarters to sort of make the assumption, even if you don't articulate it, that all Black people are fundamentally the same. Or maybe that's going too far, but that all Black people want the same thing. And we talk in journalism, and I think in other aspects of public life, about the Black vote, the Black farmer, Black churches, Black attitudes towards police. And that is, as I know you all know, just such a vast oversimplification. And even if all Black people are bonded by their Black identity, they come from many different places. Some are urbanized and highly sophisticated. Some are rural and perfectly content to be there. They belong to different religions. They have different dreams. And I think that every time I see an expression used in the press like a Black spokeswoman or a Black official, I feel as if there's a lack of subtlety coming in the coverage. And of course, I think the same thing is equally true when we consider Latinx people. And it's very easy for the establishment and for people who live in white suburbs to sort of talk about Latin people, or we've seen a lot about the Latin vote. And, are Latin voters going for Biden? Are Latin voters going with Trump? And perhaps, well, I see this even in New York, but it's pretty obvious that there are dozens of countries that have contributed Latinx immigrants to the U.S. and to New York City. There was a period when the first wave of immigration came in the 50s that most of the Spanish speaking people in New York City were from either Puerto Rico or Cuba, while in the Southwest, in Arizona and California and Texas, they were almost entirely from Mexico. And so, in some cases, different languages to the extent that they had different slang, different cultural expressions, different cuisines, different music. And I think, and maybe in some cases, different political values. And then in New York, in more recent years, we had the massive wave of Dominican immigration, and then subsequently a Mexican wave of our own. And I think that in the news coverage and, maybe even in parts of the white world and maybe even the black world, there is an inability to recognize all that diversity and to just categorize people simply as black or Latin. And I think when we're thinking about how to analyze coverage of race and how to make it better, it really behooves us to be aware of the rich diversity within every category, and that it's just not useful as a social construct or as a journalistic principle to think there's a white point of view, a black point of view, a Latinx point of view, and so on. We don't see this so much in New York City, but many of these same issues apply to our views of and our coverage of Native Americans. And there's often discussion in the mainstream press. And I think it sometimes doesn't distinguish very clearly among the different tribes, among the regions of the country, among the languages that they spoke tribally, about what their values are. And so, all of what I'm saying fits into this general tendency of journalism at many levels to simplify and maybe oversimplify in this attempt to foster understanding. And sometimes that's successful, and sometimes it gets people interested and they want more and more subtlety in their coverage. But I think it also has the effect of reinforcing stereotypes, and that's something we all want to try to avoid. I think, too, it's very hard to generalize about race and racial attitudes and coverage of race. And I think, for starters, though, we can see that whatever one's feelings about goals, and that varies considerably, too, there's a vigorous and sometimes hostile disagreement about tactics. And historically, you can look at the difference between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. There were tensions there when John Lewis, the congressman and former civil rights activist, died early in this semester. The obituaries mentioned that he was the speaker before Dr. King at the March on Washington that is remembered for the I Had a Dream speech, and that Lewis gave a speech that was much angrier, much more forceful, and much more militant in its suggestion of tactics. And it's interesting to, those happened on the same platform at the same time, and one became famous and the other not so. And maybe that's because the message of the former was more comfortable for journalists to report and celebrate than the latter. I think that we would like to see, well, I shouldn't generalize. I would like to see, I think many of you would like to see journalistic coverage that reflects the rich diversity of society. And I think that there's always opportunity to grow. I think that many news organizations are trying to do that. Many of them at the same time are limited by their financial resources, and there can be a lot of pressure in setting priorities. Many years ago, this would, I guess, have been back in the 70s, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times was a man named Abe Rosenthal, who was one of the influential journalists of his time. And he was giving a talk, or he was leading a panel discussion of people from the Times for about 800 New York City teachers. And I was one of the panelists. And when we got to the point where they were taking questions from the audience, one of the teachers said, "The New York Times has 2 reporters based in Boston and none based in the Bronx. And how does that make sense for a New York newspaper?" And Abe paused just for a second and then said, "We have more readers in the Bronx. We have more readers in Boston than we do in the Bronx." And that was probably true at the time. But I think subsequently the Times began to much more aggressively cover New York City, to look more closely at things that were happening, to develop an interest in discovering the rich and varied neighborhoods. And I think that that continues to this day, though, once again, you have to decide how many theater critics can I afford to have, how many foreign correspondents, how many sports reporters, and when you need to make a cut, where are you going to cut? So I think that the issues of coverage of immigration, coverage of race, and some of the other topics that we will get into subsequently, often need to be seen in the context of the economics of the business of journalism. And some of it is apparent to us and some of it is not, because it can be very difficult with companies that are not publicly traded to get access to their finances. And even within large companies that own many papers, it can be difficult to see what the resources are that are devoted to one publication rather than another, and how much money it brings in. So that per se is not the focus of this course, but I just wanted to say that the decisions you make about coverage, about building an audience, about how much money you're going to put into that, often reflect the business side of the operation and what is likely to bring you in more money, both in terms of profit and in terms of reinvestment in different resources. I do feel encouraged that I think there is both internal desire in many newsrooms and great public pressure and scrutiny about coverage of racial issues. And, in particular, I think this last year, not to oversimplify, but has brought a new woke moment where race is being talked about very openly almost every day. There are vigorous debates on the issues and, how much is current practices and how much is it systemic deficiencies. And do we recognize that? Do we want to overcome them? And how do we go about overcoming them? There are no simple answers, and all you really can ask for, I think, is goodwill and the ability, the curiosity to ask good questions and the ability to listen to the answers. And I think that's something those of us involved in training journalists are working on, and those of us who still have a foot or 2 feet in newsrooms are engaging with a great deal. If I think of other things that I want to say about this, I will maybe do another tape. I'm going to, in addition to the pieces in the folder, I'm going to email you a couple of pieces that were just published in the last couple of days. One is an article that was a very lengthy article that was published in the New York Times about its own racist history, sort of an acknowledgement to its staff and its readers of this. And we don't think about the Los Angeles Times very much, and very few of us on this coast read it. But it is the most important and most respected American newspaper west of the Mississippi. And most people would probably rank it fourth in influence after the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post. So it's good to know what they're thinking, and I think this article, these set of articles that were just published, will help illuminate that. Maybe at a news organization and a newspaper that you haven't thought about. So I hope you find the material this week engaging. I hope you can, whatever happens in the debate later today, sort of process that, but also stay with the week's topic. And we will have plenty of time in coming weeks to talk about political coverage and what's good and what's bad and so on. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. I was actually very uncharacteristically took 48 hours off of email on Sunday and Monday, so I'm catching up. And within the next 2 days, I will have back to you everything that's been submitted in the last week. And I look forward to hearing any questions you have about this. So thank you very much.